of all, welcome to the Coffee Break webinar series from the Interest Group on Agricultural Data. We are glad that you're here with us, whether this is your morning coffee break or your evening coffee break or somewhere in between. My name is Cynthia Parr. I am with the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and I'm one of the 3 co-chairs of the Research Data Alliance Interest Group on Agricultural Data. Emma Subaratz and Deborah Drucker are the other 2 chairs. This is one of a series of webinars that we've been having, and today we will be hearing from 2 of our colleagues from CONABIO in Mexico, Dr. Mestreta Llanas and Irene Ramos, and very excited to hear about their talk about developing an information system to support agrobiodiversity conservation in Mexico. And so we will have questions at the end of their talk, and feel free to put questions in the chat. And with that, I welcome our 2 guest speakers, and you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Irene, could you start sharing? Thank you. So thank you for that kind introduction. I'm gonna start this talk and then Irene will continue. And I would like to start by, I'm Alicia, by the way. I would like to start by providing you a bit of background on what CONABIO is and the GEF project where we're working. So CONABIO is a National Commission for the Knowledge and Use of Biodiversity. We are kind of a government-based research institute that is also the bridge between academia and government. Among many other things, we coordinate biodiversity data collection and preservation in our country. This involves from coordinating and even funding research groups from other institutions to go to the field, but also gathering data from external sources. We are the GBF national node. We currently have more than 14 million specimen records following international data standards, specifically Darwin Core. And importantly, all these records, each one of them passes a high quality control while we check taxonomic data, but also geographic location and other details. CONABIO has been working also with agrobiodiversity, that is diversity related to agriculture and that is human managed since several years ago, but we haven't really started to incorporate this into our information systems until relatively recently. For the reasons that Irene will explain later, this is a difficult task, but before I would like to tell you why we are interested as a country in agrobiodiversity to start with. Well, Mexico is one of the places where agriculture was invented, and it's also a center of crop domestication and diversification. You can see that England is not there for a reason. This means that we have very good food. Interesting started 10,000 years ago and continues today. Campesinos and campesinas are still using local land races of which they have their own seeds that use for the next cycle. Therefore, continue the process of evolution and continue adapting crops to local everyone here.
The time deadline.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, Alicia, but you froze. So maybe if you turn off your video.
Hello, I'm back, I think. Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah.
turning off video just in case there's a bandwidth issue.
Okay, I will stop mine too. So were you able to hear this slide?
This one, yes, but
Yeah. Okay, so next one, please. Okay, so another one of the reasons why we as a country are interested in agrobiodiversity is because the smallholders I just mentioned are not only heirs for this rich agrobiodiversity involving several crop species, but also they are very important for our national food security. This is an example of a research we carried on at CONABIO, where we show the importance of maize production done by campesino agriculture. You can see in yellowish in the map that this type of agriculture occurs all over the country, mostly with land races. And although maize production by campesino agriculture or smallholders is seen as something unproductive that happens in less than 5 hectares in average, in the aggregate, when you sum up the contribution of all of these small farms, it turns out that they are producing far more what it is needed for self-consumption. Therefore, we have shown that the campesino agriculture that are holding the agrobiodiversity, it's also very important for food security. Next one, please. So at CONABIO, we are carrying out a project on Mexican agrobiodiversity funded by the Global Environmental Facility and implemented by FAO, where we aim to work with most of these, with 12 representative crop species of Mexico, which you can see in the screen, very delicious species, all of them. The project has 4 components: knowledge, public policy, markets, and building up local capacities. And I'm going to focus here on the knowledge component, which involves the creation and development of the information system for agrobiodiversity. The main objective of this system is to generate and systematize open data on these 12 crops. This involves creating new data, going to the field, and coordinating the teams that go to the field, actually, but also gathering data from other sources. And the final objective of this system is to be able to inform food security and conservation public policies. With this, I will give the word to my colleague Irene.
Yes, thank you, Alicia. So I will give you a very quick overview of the data that we're working with. First, we are integrating data that we already had, like the Global Native Maize Project. When it was published a few years ago, the agronomic variables of this data set did not fit into the databases that follow the Darwin Core standard at CONABIO. So these were separated from the biological and geographical information. In the new system, we are processing the data again so that everything associated with a record appears as an integrated database. There are also several teams collecting new data for SIAgro all across the country, often in collaboration with local communities. And they collect everything from taxonomic information to uses and common names of agrobiodiversity. A few data sets come from partner institutions, like this one on nutritional information. Next, we have qualitative assessments of production, commerce, and use of biodiversity, which are collected in focus groups with communities. And this last one is one I really like. These food baskets take the idea of the healthy eating plate at a regional level. They are a collection of local ingredients, recipes, and stories related to traditional food. As you can imagine, working with all this data is not easy. There are 2 things that make agrobiodiversity different from biodiversity data more generally. First is that apart from the biological and geographical components, they include a social, cultural, and agronomic component that cannot be separated from the rest. The second is that data are very often generated in collaboration with local communities and donors. And of course, this comes with challenges related to integration, data standards, protocols for quality control, and data reuse. We don't have all the answers, but what we're doing in SIAgro is implementing practices at all the stages of the data life cycle to make sure that our workflow is fair from the beginning. I will only mention a few, but if you're curious about the rest, then you can ask us later. So starting from data collection, instead of using paper or spreadsheets, we use digital surveys in COBO. COBO is an open source tool developed by the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative. And the way that this works is that teams who are doing field data collection use a pre-designed survey in the mobile app. It can also be used offline, but as soon as the device has an internet connection, then we can immediately have the data in our own servers. And of course, this remains accessible to the teams through a web application. Using COBO, we avoid a lot of errors, and it also makes it very easy to clean, to check the data, and to give feedback to the teams who can edit the records in the same application. We have put a lot of effort into standardizing the vocabularies for social, cultural, and agronomic variables. As you may know, these are less developed than for biological or geographical data. And much of this work is based on a taxonomy of uses and management of Mexican biodiversity that another area of CONABIO published. It is a very rich taxonomy, but we still struggle with the balance between representing the diversity of our data and standardization. Here's an example of the taxonomy of traditional agroecosystems, which includes over 30 categories. And we used these controlled vocabularies in the digital surveys in COBO and also during revision. I mentioned that one challenge in other projects was integrating data that is not biological or geographical. In SIAgro, we solved this with a new software that was developed in collaboration with a team in the Jülich Research Center. This is Centro. Centro is a set of code generators that creates a data warehouse based on models that are defined by the user. So it takes these models as JSON files, and it generates an API and a graphical user interface with basic database functions. And they can very easily connect to local or remote databases. For SIAgro, what we do is that some data live in Centro instances, and we connect them to the biological data that live somewhere else in CONABIO. But to the user, it appears like an integrated database. So this software is open source and it is ready to use. I won't go into the technical details. Soon we will publish a paper with all technical specifications and case studies, like the way that we're using it in SIAgro. So we're very happy to talk about this. Finally, in previous projects, we noticed that people who helped collect data did not always have the skills to reuse them. And to close this gap, we organized a workshop on data literacy skills. So more than statistics or tools, we focused on FAIR principles, ethical data use, and how open data is really a collaborative effort. We do this because we care a lot about increasing the participation in SIAgro beyond data collection. So when we think of our information system of SIAgro, it's not only about the databases and the technical tools. there is an important community component because a lot of the work is coordinating teams or building the capacity to actually use the system. And there's also a theoretical side. By this, I mean contributing to develop data standards, or even just documenting and sharing our experience as a case study, which we hope is valuable beyond CONABIO. As a preview of our next steps, we are now testing the publication of the first data sets with users. We don't yet have a data portal. Eventually we will, but first, we want to take advantage of the infrastructure that CONABIO already has. So we're testing the integration with data portals. For example, our own version of the Encyclopedia of Life that I show here. And I'm going to finish here. I just want to acknowledge our team and thank you for listening.
Thank you so very much. Very, very interesting talk. And since you mentioned it at the very end, I will just share with you that I used to work for the Encyclopedia of Life in the United States and collaborated with a lot of your colleagues from CONABIO at that time. So I'm really glad that my previous work and my work at USDA is starting to come together. So I'm very excited. And so on that note, I actually will start off maybe with the first question, but I encourage others to get your questions ready. So I'm curious, because you started in your talk talking about all of the different land races that are so important for maize agriculture in Mexico. Have you experienced challenges in sharing the specimen data related to those land races with GBIF? Are those land races included well in the taxonomies that the rest of the world uses, or is there some challenge because they're below the species level, and I know that it may be a lot more difficult?
Well, maybe our face expressions tell you everything right now, but long story short, we haven't crossed that bridge. We know it's there. We are less terrified of it every step, but nonetheless, it's still a complicated process because land races taxonomy change depending to the crop. So in the case of maize, we are talking about maize races, which are, like 59 for Mexico. And there is also variation within these races, right? But then when you talk about chili, then they are varieties, and there is even in other cases, there are races and varieties. And so it gets very complicated. So right now we haven't integrated this information with GBIF. This is something that we will have to do at some point. But what we have done right now is that we have that list of categories specific for every different crop. And when we need to make decisions regarding how to standardize it to international standards, at least we have the data with what is used for that species in the agronomic context. So I hope this answers your question.
Yes, and it is pretty much as I expected, that you're able to keep the information consistent locally. And exactly. So I assume you've created some identifiers yourself that you're using across your own data sets to combine, for example, the specimen data with any associated research data for those specimens.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. All right, do we have any other questions? All right, well, I have another question, and this is a question that is always top of my mind, and there's no easy answers to this one either. As you're building these new systems and you have these wonderful collaborations, how are you planning to measure your success? I mean, in this case, you are hoping to influence actual conservation practices or conservation policy. And yet it's a big job to actually build the data systems, and any impacts may be far in the future. So what are your thoughts about how you'll be reporting to your management or your leadership about how successful you are?
Oof, that's a tough question too. It can be answered at different levels. I will let Irene answer part of it, but I will start with what I think I can answer. So we cheat a bit in terms of indicators for the, I shouldn't be saying this, but well, the, the indicators that we are supposed to report to the Global Environmental Facility are easy to assess quantitatively. For instance, one of our indicators is to have, we have 12 crops and we have to have 12 databases, one of each one, right? So that's easy to measure one. Another indicator is the number of stakeholders that are using our system. And we measure this as the number of institutions and people that are using the tools that we are developing, like the local instance of Kobo, but also the users of our Sendro instances on the graphical user interface, for instance, to incorporate more nutritional data, for example. So that's like small quantitative steps that we have reporting during the life of the project. But the hardest one, of course, is how are we going to measure the impact with the public usage and also on public policy. And I don't know here if Irene, you would like to comment on that, or do you want me to finish?
I just want to share maybe about the second point about having an impact with different stakeholders and users. As I mentioned, part of that, we really care about building the capacity to actually use the system. And so some indicators that we have been measuring is in these workshops that we have offered, we have feedback surveys. And there we ask about the participants' previous experience with data, and we contrast that with whether they report increased awareness of open data. So those are like, I guess, complementary indicators to a stakeholder uptake of the system. Yeah, but in terms of, I guess, policy and conservation, Alicia, maybe you have something else to say?
Well, I just want to say that the information system, as I mentioned towards the beginning of the presentation, is part of a larger project, and it's part of the knowledge component of a project that also has the public policy, the markets, and the building local capacities components. So our idea is that they are intersected, they work together. So therefore, part of the information that is in SIAgro is, for instance, already being used by our colleagues working in public policy to, you know, convince decision makers to make some decisions on one direction or the other. And very fortunately, this has been successful already. So in that sense, even if the system is still being generated and produced, the data and the information is already being used by our colleagues for public policy. And this is one indicator of our success, that it's already with a very nice green tick.
Wonderful. That's great to hear. I know that we always say that we want that to be the outcome of our work, but it's not always so easy to find out when that happens. So it's good that you have those close collaborations as part of a larger project. Any other questions from our attendees?
So let me just thank Alicia and Irene. It's very nice, your work, and it's very interesting. Thank you very much for your talk. I'm looking forward to see the paper you mentioned on the tool. So if you could share with the IGAD community when it's out there, it would be great. And also, if you could just say any workflow that you mentioned of the life cycle, is it going to be also in the paper, or is there anywhere we can find besides the slide more about how you are dealing with the data quality and all the steps?
Go ahead,
Yeah.
Irene.
On that point, as I mentioned, on the, I guess, theoretical component of SIAgro, what we're doing is documenting this experience. And so, yes, we will publish eventually, I guess, the data journey from collection to publication and all the, I guess, technical, conceptual, and social challenges that we have solved, and we have some of them we haven't solved. We don't have yet a date because we are in the early stages of that process, of that research process. But I guess something that I can tell you is that in the upcoming RDA plenary, we will share a poster documenting the journey from data collection to how agrobiodiversity data actually reaches policy. It will be like the first steps in our research process, but you can look forward to that part.
Great.
Yeah, and a small clarification about the paper. The paper is the paper that I didn't mention in the talk. It's only on the Sendro tool of this new software we are building. But you don't have to wait for the paper because the documentation is already out there, and we are eager to have users external to the developing team to start using it. So if you want, yeah, we can leave you the link here, have a look, and if you find it useful and want to start testing it, please go ahead and we can help you if you have problems at any step.
Thank you very much.
All right, thanks. It looks like Pilar Santa Coloma has a question.
Yes, thank you, Alicia and Irene. A very, very interesting presentation. Just for those who are here, I am the LTO, the project from FEO. And I wanted to ask two questions. I know that you mentioned already the challenges in terms of the use of the data. But very interestingly, the project have managed to add the nutritional values of the species being investigated. So, how do you find this knowledge sharing with the producers, for instance, and probably the policymakers? How has been that process? How they are using that information, for instance, on nutritional values of this of the products. And the second question is maybe we are, but the project also has to do with the impacts of climate change, etc. Is there any possibility to see any surprising results in terms of the species that have probably been lost, or even that were expected to have been lost but are there, and you find that they are still there and were not recorded in previous, in previous research. So thank you for your question, for your answers.
Yeah, so I can answer the first question and I will let Alicia answer the second one. So in terms of how other stakeholders are using the data, first, we are in the early stages of this system. So we haven't finished data collection. Actually, the nutritional data set is one of the projects that has I guess the most development so far. And in that case, a lot of our work has been about first of all, communicating the value of an information system, because these users might not be technical users. So a lot of our work has been first sharing our work, and just, as I mentioned, like building the capacity to use the system and to communicate the value of having this infrastructure, and communicating what possibilities become available when data are standardized, when data are open. This has been like an early stage of our collaboration with this partner institution. And we're not yet at a stage where we're sharing the data with producers. So many of the people who are collecting the data are academic users. They come from universities across the country. So it's easier to communicate to them the value of a research infrastructure. But again, we're doing a lot of work of actually building the capacity of using open data.
Thank you, Irene. Before going to the second question, I'm gonna just complement Irene's answer, because what Irene mentioned is true for, let's say, quantitative nutritious data that we have about, I don't know, the amount of vitamins or other micronutrients. But I think that the regional baskets of good food, for instance, or good eating, they indirectly are a way of communicating the value of nutrition that have these crops for a wider audience, even if they are not telling you the amount of iron that Quelite has, right? But they are providing the message of the importance of eating different vegetables and a diverse diet with the local ingredients. And those baskets have been very, very popular, actually more than what we thought they were going to be. And they are being used currently by other governmental instances to promote a healthy eating. And we even are opening a second call for applications to extend this initiative to other regions of Mexico that were not in the first round. So that's an indirect way of promoting this data. And we also have more outreach publications talking about nutrition, even if we are not using the quantitative data that is in the system directly. And on the second question, oh gosh, I just blank. What was it?
Climate change as a potential.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it's interesting because we had a lot of information previously on maize, for instance, but because that data was developed in a previous project in 2008 around that. But before that, we were not sure if native land races of maize were still around. And that's the case for the other 11 crops of the project. We know they are there, but there wasn't a baseline currently of what exactly are they in terms of how many varieties, where are they cultivated, are they using commercial varieties, or the local land races still exist. We had no data at the national level of that. So what we are creating is a first baseline for it. That's for the sampling. But in the focus groups, which are, it's not quantitative data, but it gives you a good standard or a good idea of whether a species is rare in a community or a crop variety is rare in a community. That is like, I don't know, only an old lady is cultivating it in her backyard versus the whole community having it. So that information has been very surprising for the people participating in the focus groups to start with, because they are realizing that something that they thought that was more abundant is not. Maybe it was abundant when they were kids, but now it's becoming more rare. And just participating in the workshops is helping them to realize this and willing to get the seeds from the neighbors and start cultivating more one of these varieties. So it's a very local example, very difficult to extrapolate it. I think more than climate change, it's more cultural process that are linked to losing one of these varieties. But it's also the solution, therefore, to continue conserving them is also cultural, which is hopefully easier than fixing climate change. Thank you.
Thank you. Very, very interesting answers and raising more questions for me. But I know that some people may need to leave because we usually keep these somewhat limited in time. So I encourage you to attend the the final two webinars in this series. They will take place October 20th and October 27th. So please do look at the RDA and AIMS websites for those announcements, and we hope to see you there. And I'm willing to stay a few extra minutes for additional questions. So if that's okay with you, Alicia and Irene, are you available? Good. Okay. So again, thank you all for coming, and feel free to stay now if you wish, and if you can't, we understand, and we hope to see you next time. So my question that I just thought of as you were answering the previous question is that clearly a lot of the crops that you're studying are also in other countries nearby, and I'm wondering about international collaborations and whether either your systems or your data are easily integrated with other nations that may have similar studies happening. And in particular, I know that in the US, we have the data modeling community that's creating the agricultural research data network within the US, but for support of global crop modeling. And I imagine that you've worked with them out of University of Florida, but I'm just curious how your international collaborations might be working.
We are not working with them, to be honest, but it's probably something we should do. And one caveat of our system, not caveat, one particularity of our system is that we really want to focus on land races and cultural or socio-ecological information that is useful for local farmers. So this makes collaborating with international projects harder because we start having, just very different variables. But this is definitely something we should do, and I take a note of this community you mentioned. What we have done is that we had a previous project funded by the Darwin Initiative focused on crop-wide relatives. And this project was carried out in a collaboration with Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. I think I'm not missing anyone. And there we put together all our records on crop-wide relatives as different countries. And this is not as simple as it seems, because for instance, Phaseolus coccineus, which is a bean, and that's a scientific name of the crop-wide relative, and that's also a scientific name of the crop. There is no difference in the name whatsoever. If you see a record in an herbarium that says Phaseolus coccineus, we have no way of knowing if it is a wild or a domesticated variety unless there is extra data, which often there isn't, and we had to go through a very complicated process just to take that information out. But that was done for these three, four, including Mexico, Mesoamerican countries. Irene, would you like to add anything?
Just in terms of the challenges of integrating data with international collaborations, if maybe that happens in the future. We hope that the data models that we're designing will contribute to, develop data standards And we are aware, for example, that there is an initiative to extend the Darwin Core Standard for agrobiodiversity. We haven't looked into that in detail, but we hope our case study will, I guess, illustrate either the need for including more variables or just different needs that we might have.
Thanks. Actually, I would also like to recommend to you that you've learned a lot of lessons about how to work in this sociocultural area, that even if the specifics of your communities are not as easily integrated, the approach that you're taking is, I think, very important. And so I especially was thinking of your workshops and talking about general rareness or abundance and the ability to build capacity to use these systems among those communities, and the impact that you can have by at least making it clear that something that used to be very common is not so common anymore. So so I think the lessons that you're learning are especially valuable to share with your international colleagues. So I thank you for that, and I'm just looking to see if there's any other questions, and if not, then we will conclude. So thank you again, Alicia and Irina. I think this was a wonderful talk, and I'm planning to share this recording with a bunch of my colleagues, and hopefully we can continue the conversation in the future. So thank you again, and thank you everyone for your attendance, and we will see you next time. Have a good day.
Muchas gracias. Thank you very much. Bye.